Introduction to Quantitative Research for Health Sciences Education. Emphases, variables and their roles, experimental and non-experimental methods. My name's Ken Kaur, and this is the first lesson in a series of lessons on quantitative research for health sciences education. The quantitative research paradigm is one that treats reality as something that is organized and knowable through the generation of evidence and the testing of hypotheses. Quantitative research aims to develop understanding to explain how the world works in specific ways and tends to lend itself well to the natural and physical sciences where measurement is very objective and rules can be readily defined. From a biological perspective, the field of health and life sciences also lends itself well to this paradigm, but things start to become more challenging when we start to study concepts of the mind and outcomes like quality of life and learning. Quantitative research has also been heavily applied in education, but again, it requires a lot of work defining objective ways to measure. While studying hard-to-measure concepts like learning and motivation with human beings in an educational context introduces a lot of logistical and ethical challenges, many worthwhile questions can be studied with quantitative research in health sciences education. The building blocks of quantitative research are variables. Quantitative research employs the use of variables to describe and explain concepts and how they relate to one another. Variables can be described in and of themselves in descriptive research, but often variables are studied in relation to one another. In these situations, we often refer to them as either independent or dependent variables. Variables can be categorical or label-based in nature, or continuous. Some examples of categorical variables for educational settings are things like simulation versus didactic lessons, gender identity, previous experience versus no previous experience, racialized versus not racialized, primed versus not primed, high versus medium versus low socioeconomic status. Attendance method. Recently during COVID, we've started to deliver education slightly differently. So we have things like online synchronous, online asynchronous, and in-person. Continuous examples include things like age, admissions GPA, standardized test scores, personality test scores, and years of experience. Dependent variables are more likely to be continuous, like scores on a measure of motivation, achievement test scores, assignment grades, course grades, time spent studying, number of visits to the class webpage, or program GPA. But they can also be categorical in some cases, like pass versus fail, or progressed versus held back. One important thing to note is that all the examples I gave you could actually play either role as an independent or predictor variable or a dependent variable. It really just depends on how you are studying the concepts. Sometimes we study more than two variables at a time in quantitative research. Variables that are the reason why an independent variable relates to a dependent variable are called mediating variables or intervening variables. For example, a study might investigate whether a simulation compared to traditional methods of teaching improves motivation to learn because it increases self-efficacy. In this example, because it identifies self-efficacy as the mediator. It acts between the type of teaching method and motivation to learn. Another type of variable in quantitative research that studies more than two concepts is the moderating variable. Moderating variables explain how the nature of the relationship between two other variables differ depending on the levels of the moderator. Levels are the different categories of a variable. Moderating variables are almost always categorical, like gender identity or having an experience versus not having an experience or personality type. For example, you might predict that the relationship between the type of grading system you have in an educational setting, so pass-fail versus letter grades, can positively or negatively impact motivation to learn. But you might also hypothesized that that relationship differs depending on whether students are task or achievement oriented. So, for example, someone who's task oriented would probably thrive and be more motivated in a pass-fail system than in a letter grading system. However, someone who's achievement oriented, focused on grades, may be more motivated to learn in a letter grading system. So goal orientation serves as a moderating variable of that relationship. There are two big categories of methods in quantitative research. The first is experimental research. Experiments involve the manipulation of independent variables and the random assignment of participant to study groups in order to control for extraneous and sometimes confounding variables. The strongest causal studies are experimental in nature. Experiments in education settings are challenging to set up and conduct because we're often dealing with a naturalistic environment. So if you find that an intervention has a positive impact, it's unethical to deny that intervention to half the participants. But it's also logistically hard to go back and redo the intervention, given that it can be disruptive to learning settings. It's not impossible, though, just challenging. You can do things like randomly assign at the group level, or you can implement things like delayed treatment control designs, where eventually everyone is exposed to the benefit of the intervention. There are many types of non-experimental research that are heavily used in education. These are studies where manipulation of the IV isn't possible. For example, consider a pharmaceutics class that included the use of a computer simulation program to model biopharmaceutical concepts that were typically taught in a lecture format the previous year. Students were able to manipulate different aspects of how a drug was being delivered and see the concepts in action using the software program. Comparing performance on test questions related to these concepts that were taught to this year's students and the previous year's students allowed for an inference about whether the method was resulting in a difference in students' ability. Now, this example leaves the door open for potential alternative explanations, but controls can be built in with specific statistical techniques to improve the causal strength of the inference. And while there is always a potential for alternative explanations in non-experimental research, again, many worthwhile questions can be studied using these methods. Now, I just wanted to end on this image, mainly just to show you how interesting things can get pretty quickly in quantitative educational research. This network of concepts was studied and published and rigorously reviewed and has a meaningful contribution to understanding how individuals' implicit theories of intelligence affect their academic achievement. The next lesson we'll talk about how you do literature reviews to identify research questions. See you soon.